My name is Maya. I am 29 years old and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I want to tell you about the dinner that changed everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way that moments look when you describe them afterward. It changed everything the way a crack changes a wall, quietly, in a place you almost don't notice, until one day the structure shows you what has been happening underneath. It was a Sunday in early March, one of those late winter evenings in Charlotte when the cold is finally loosening its grip, but hasn't yet let go completely. The kind of evening where you wear a jacket to the car and take it off by the time you arrive somewhere because the temperature can't quite decide. Daniel had driven. I had a container of banana bread in my lap, baked that afternoon, still slightly warm through the glass container. We were going to his parents' house for dinner. Daniel's parents, Richard and Patricia Holloway, lived in a large colonial revival on the north side of Charlotte, the kind of house that announces a certain kind of life from the street. Well-maintained, substantial, with landscaping that was clearly professionally managed, and a front door that had been repainted recently in a deep, confident navy. I had been to this house many times in the 3 years Daniel and I had been married. I knew its rhythms, the way Patricia always had something on the stove when you arrived, even if dinner was still an hour away. The way Daniel retreated to his study for the first 20 minutes of every gathering, the particular choreography of a household that had its systems and maintained them. I liked Richard. He was a quiet man, observational with a dry humor that surfaced periodically and then retreated just as quickly. He asked me genuinely and specifically about my work as a graphic designer whenever we had real conversation, and he listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested. Patricia was different. Patricia was warm in the way that certain kinds of warmth are also a form of management. She was impeccably gracious, always perfectly dressed for whatever the occasion was, generous with compliments that occasionally had a second layer underneath them if you listened carefully. She loved Daniel with the specific intensity of a woman who had built her identity substantially around her son, and she received me, I had always felt this from the beginning, as an addendum to Daniel rather than a person in my own right. I had made my peace with this, or I had been making it, the ongoing work of adjusting expectations without losing yourself. Dinner was roast chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans. The table was set properly, cloth napkins, the good china Patricia brought out for gatherings. Richard had opened wine. The conversation moved through its usual channels. Daniel's work, a neighborhood development Patricia had opinions about, a cousin's recent engagement. It was ordinary. It was comfortable in the specific way of a dinner you have attended enough times to know its shape. Then Patricia said it. She said it during a pause in the conversation, in the light, conversational tone she used for things she had been holding and found the right gap to place into. Maya, I've been thinking, your parents' property must be worth something significant now with how the market has moved. Have you had any conversations with them about their plans? I looked at her. She was cutting her chicken. She did not look up. Their plans? I said. For the future, she set her knife down briefly. For the property, what they intend to do with it. A small, warm smile. You're their only child, after all. It's natural to think about these things. The table was quiet for a moment. Daniel was looking at his plate. Richard picked up his wine glass. I held what had just happened in my mind for a moment, the specific, careful shape of it, the casual tone that was not casual, the "you're their only child" that was not an observation, but a lever. I said, "They're in good health. We don't really have those conversations." Of course, Patricia said, warmly, moving on. I just think it's wise to plan ahead, for everyone's sake. She refilled my water glass without being asked. I said, "Thank you." and the dinner continued. But something had entered the room that did not leave with the dishes. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet. I waited for him to say something about the comment, to acknowledge it, to gently contextualize it, to offer the small, reassuring gesture of a partner who is on your side, even when the thing requiring the gesture is his own mother. He said, "Traffic on Park Road is always bad on Sundays." I looked at the streetlights going past the window. "Your mom asked about my parents' property," I said. A pause. "She's just thinking practically. That's how she is." "It felt like more than practical," I said. "Maya," a gentle tone, the tone of someone asking you to let something go. "She didn't mean anything by it. That's just Mom." I turned back to the window. That's just Mom. I had been hearing that sentence in various forms for 3 years. It was the sentence that ended conversations about Patricia before they could fully begin. It was a door closed softly but firmly, and I had been accepting it because I had been trying to be a good daughter-in-law, a flexible person, a woman who didn't make things harder than they needed to be. But something had shifted tonight, and I was not yet sure what it was going to mean. My parents live in a neighborhood in East Charlotte called Glenwood Park, a modest neighborhood, good people, well-kept yards, the kind of street where neighbors know each other's names and check on each other after storms. My parents have lived in the same house there for 26 years. A 3-bedroom ranch house, nothing architecturally remarkable, with a backyard my father has turned into something genuinely beautiful over 2 decades of weekend gardening. They bought that house when I was 3 years old. My father worked in logistics management for 30 years. Not glamorous, not lucrative, but steady and dignified. The kind of work that allows a family to pay its bills and save carefully and own its home outright, which is what my parents did. They paid off their mortgage 7 years ago. My father retired last year. My mother had worked part-time as a school librarian for 20 years and had just that winter transitioned to fully retired. They were comfortable. They were not wealthy. But their home, paid off in a neighborhood whose values had climbed steadily in recent years, was worth more than it appeared from the outside. Not a fortune, but not nothing. And Patricia Holloway, who had spent her career adjacent to real estate through Richard's investment work, would have known exactly what not nothing meant in a market like Charlotte's. I did not call my mother that night. I sat on the edge of our bed after Daniel was asleep, and I thought about Patricia's question and the way Daniel had not responded to it, and the way the table had been quiet for one specific second before moving on. I thought about my parents' house, the backyard garden, my father's hands in the soil on Saturday mornings, my mother's kitchen where she made the same recipes she had been making my entire life, where the smell of her cooking was so specific to my childhood that it lived in my body more than my memory. I thought about the word inheritance, and I felt something I could not immediately name, a feeling that sat at the intersection of protectiveness and clarity, that said, whatever is being started here, I need to understand it before it gets further along than I can stop. Because Patricia had planted a seed at that dinner table, casually and with warm efficiency, and I needed to decide, before it had time to grow, what I was going to do about it. To understand why Patricia's question landed the way it did, you need to understand where I come from. Not geographically. Charlotte is Charlotte, and the neighborhoods of my childhood are 10 minutes from the neighborhoods of my adult life, which is either the comfort or the complication of staying in the city where you were born, depending on the day. I mean, you need to understand the specific texture of the family I grew up inside, because that texture is the thing that makes everything that followed meaningful rather than just dramatic. My father's name is George. He is 61 years old, a man of medium height and extraordinary patience, who has the particular quality of people who do not need to fill silence, who can sit in a room with you without speaking and make you feel more accompanied than most people do with words. He worked in logistics for 30 years, managing warehouses and shipping routes, and the thousand practical problems of moving physical things from one place to another, and he brought to that work the same methodical care he brought to everything: his garden, his home repairs, the conversations he had with me throughout my childhood about becoming a person with integrity. My mother's name is Diane. She is 58, and she is the person from whom I inherited whatever ability I have to read a room, the specific attentiveness to what is happening beneath the surface of what is said, the sense for the gap between a person's stated intention and their actual one. She worked as a school librarian for 20 years, and she loved that work with a completeness that I found as a child slightly mysterious, and as an adult deeply admirable. She read voraciously, remembered everything, and had the librarian's particular gift for finding exactly what someone needed before they fully knew they needed it. They had been married for 32 years when this story takes place. Not perfectly, no 32 years is perfect, but solidly in the way that two people who have chosen each other repeatedly through difficulty end up solid. They argued occasionally. They were not immune to stress or disagreement or the accumulated friction of shared life, but they had a foundation, and I had grown up inside it, and the foundation had taught me things about what a relationship is supposed to look like, that I was still, in my own marriage, trying to honor. The house in Glenwood Park was the physical expression of my entire childhood. Not in a sentimental, preserved in amber way. It changed as I grew. Rooms repurposed, furniture updated, the kitchen remodeled the year I was in high school when my parents had saved enough to do it properly. But it held the accumulation of our life in the way that only a place you have lived in for 26 years can hold things. In the specific angle of the afternoon light in the living room, in the way the back door screen caught slightly if you didn't lift it as you pushed, in the smell of my mother's cooking that was so specific to that kitchen that I could reconstruct it entirely from memory. My father's garden was in the backyard. He had started it the year after they moved in, a modest plot initially, expanding over 2 decades until it occupied the full length of the yard and contained, depending on the season, tomatoes and zucchini and pole beans and the roses my mother loved arranged along the back fence. He had built raised beds himself from lumber he bought and cut and treated. He spent his Saturday mornings in that garden the way other men spent theirs on golf courses or in front of televisions, with total absorption and visible contentment. I had grown up in that garden, pulling weeds on summer mornings, being taught the names of plants, learning from my father's example that work done carefully and without hurry produces things worth having. Money was not plentiful in my childhood. I want to be honest about this because honesty about it matters. My parents were not poor. We were, accurately described, a working middle-class family. My father's salary was stable and sufficient, my mother's part-time income supplemental, and together they made choices that prioritized security over comfort and ownership over display. We took modest vacations. I wore clothes that were practical rather than fashionable. My parents bought used cars and drove them until they were no longer worth repairing. They saved, consistently, disciplined, over decades. They paid extra on the mortgage every month when they could. They contributed to retirement accounts steadily. They did not spend money they did not have, a principle my father articulated so often throughout my childhood that it became part of the internal architecture of how I thought about money. When I went to college, they paid what they could, and I took modest loans for the rest, which I had paid off by the time I was 27 through exactly the discipline they had modeled.
My father had offered, more than once, to help with the loan payments. I had declined, not because I didn't need the help, but because I understood that the money he was offering was the money he and my mother needed for their own future, and I was not willing to diminish that future for my present convenience. This is the family Patricia Holloway was talking about when she said your parents' property must be worth something significant. These are the people she was positioning as an asset to be evaluated, and this, the specific, personal, 32 years deep reality of what my parents were and had built and meant, is why I could not do what she was suggesting. Not because of the money, not because of the property values or the market or what nothing meant in Charlotte's current real estate landscape. Because my parents' house was not an asset. It was the garden my father had been building for 20 years. It was the kitchen where my mother cooked from memory. It was the paid-off proof of 30 years of careful, dignified work by two people who had never once asked me to treat their lives as a resource for my future. And I was not going to start. I had met Daniel 4 years before this story begins, at a mutual friend's birthday gathering where we ended up in a corner conversation about a documentary we had both seen and had different opinions about. And the conversation had the specific quality of an exchange where you realize gradually, and then suddenly, that the person across from you is someone you want to keep talking to. He was warm, funny in an understated way, thoughtful in his opinions without being rigid about them. He worked in financial analysis, which meant he was comfortable with numbers and slightly less comfortable with ambiguity, which I had always found both understandable and occasionally frustrating in a person I loved. We dated for a year. We got engaged. We were married in a small ceremony at a garden venue outside Charlotte. My mother had arranged the flowers herself, an act of love so characteristic of her that I could not look at the photographs without feeling the specific warmth of being known by someone completely. His parents had been, in the early days, what I can only describe as correctly warm. Patricia had welcomed me with the gracious efficiency of a woman who understood that her son had chosen someone and was prepared to receive that person accordingly. There were no dramatic early conflicts, no obvious friction. She was present and organized and occasionally overwhelming, but I had told myself this was simply the texture of a different kind of family than mine, and had tried to receive it that way. The dinner in March was the first moment when the texture beneath the surface became undeniable. In the week after that dinner, I paid attention. I noticed things I had registered before but not fully examined. The way Patricia, when talking about Daniel's future, always folded me into it as an instrument rather than a subject, for Daniel's security, for your family's stability, for what you two will build. The way she spoke about money with a fluency that was not just comfortable, but acquisitive, always oriented toward more, toward leverage, toward what could be extracted from a situation. She had, over 3 years, built a detailed picture of my parents' life, their neighborhood, their retirement, their property, through the kind of incremental conversational information gathering that is so smooth you don't notice it happening until you see the picture that has been assembled. She knew a great deal about my parents for someone who had met them 4 times. I had provided the information, in the ordinary course of talking about my family, answering her questions, being the kind of person who answers questions because she has been raised to believe that openness is a virtue. I had not understood until the dinner in March what the questions were for.
Patricia did not stop at the dinner table comment. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. What happened after March was not a single incident that I am placing under a retrospective microscope. It was a campaign, deliberate, patient, conducted across multiple channels with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing people toward outcomes for a long time and had a particular skill for making the management feel like care. The second approach came 2 weeks after the dinner. Patricia called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Not Daniel, me. She did this occasionally, and I had always received it as a gesture of relationship building, which perhaps it was in the beginning. This call had the specific quality of a conversation that had been prepared. She asked about my work, my week, a friend of mine she had met once and remembered the name of, the social fluency that made her formidable. And then, warmly, conversationally, "I've been thinking about what we talked about at dinner, about your parents' plans. I hope I didn't overstep. I just think, Maya, that you're someone who thinks long term, and it would be such a shame to be in a position someday where decisions get made without your input. That happens, more than people expect." I held the phone and kept my voice neutral. "My parents are very organized people," I said. "I don't have any concerns." Of course," the warmth remaining steady. "I just mean, it might be worth a conversation, just so you know where things stand. You're their only child, and these things—" "I appreciate the thought, Patricia," I said. "I'll keep it in mind." I got off the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. It might be worth a conversation. She was not suggesting I ask my parents how they were doing. She was suggesting I ask them what they planned to do with their house. The third approach came through Daniel. I noticed it first as a shift in language, the way certain phrases began appearing in our conversations at home that had the flavor of someone else's thoughts. Thinking practically about the future. It makes sense to have clarity on these things. Your parents aren't getting any younger, Maya. Daniel was not a cruel man. I want to say this because it is true and because fairness requires it. He was not trying to harm me or my parents. He was a man who had grown up in Patricia's household, who had absorbed her particular orientation toward money and security and planning, and who loved his mother enough to have permitted access to his thinking in ways he may not have fully recognized. He was also, I was beginning to understand, a man who found disagreement with his mother uncomfortable enough that he often resolved the discomfort by absorbing her position rather than examining it. "My mother mentioned," he said one evening, "that it might be worth knowing what your parents have set up. Legally, I mean, will, estate plan, just so we're informed." I looked at him. "Your mother mentioned this to you," I said. A brief pause. "She brought it up. She's not wrong that it's practical information." "Daniel," I set down what I was doing, "do you hear what you're saying? You're suggesting we ask our parents to show us their estate plans. Not show us, just, what then?" He was quiet. "I'm not going to do that," I said. "I want to be clear. Nobody's asking you to. Someone is. Your mother is. And now you are. And I need you to understand that I'm not going to pressure my parents about their estate, their property, or any financial decisions they make. Not now, not ever." Daniel looked at the table. "You're making this into something it isn't," he said quietly, not unkindly, the tone of someone who genuinely believes the other person is overreacting and is trying to manage the overreaction with patience. That tone, I had learned over 3 years, was one of the most difficult things to respond to, because its calmness made your own clarity feel like agitation by comparison. I did not take the bait. I am making it into exactly what it is. And I went to bed.
The direct conversation with Patricia happened in April. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us, which she did perhaps twice a year, in a way that I had always previously received as an investment in our relationship independent of Daniel. We went to a restaurant she liked, quiet and well-appointed, and we talked through the meal in the way we always talked, surface first, then gradually deeper. Over dessert, she put her hands on the table and looked at me with the specific expression of a woman who has decided the time of indirectness has passed. "Maya, I want to speak to you honestly," she said. "Please," I said. "You and Daniel are building a life, a real life. I can see it. I'm proud of it. But building a life requires resources, and resources require planning. Your parents are in their 60s. They have a paid-off property in a market that has appreciated significantly." She paused. "You are their only heir. What happens to that property when they're gone is going to be determined by decisions made now, by them and by how involved you are in those decisions." She held my gaze. "I'm not saying anything inappropriate," she said. "I'm saying what any practical person would say. Talk to them. Know where you stand. Make sure they have the right documents in place, the right designations. Protect your future. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I said, Patricia, my parents have been managing their financial life responsibly for 30 years without my input. They will continue to do that without my pressure. A small shift in her expression. I'm not suggesting pressure. I know what you're suggesting, I said, and I kept my voice exactly level. Not cold, not hostile, but completely clear. And I understand why you think it's practical, but my parents are not an investment. Their home is not an asset I'm entitled to plan around, and I am not going to approach them as though they are. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. I hope, she said, that you won't regret a lack of practicality. I might, I said honestly, but I'll live with that more easily than the alternative. We finished dessert. We drove separately to our own homes, and the warmth in Patricia's manner toward me from that afternoon forward cooled by precisely the degree that my usefulness to her purposes had diminished. April became May. May became June. The cooling was not dramatic. Patricia was too skilled for drama. It was architectural, structural, the kind of exclusion that happens through omission rather than action. An invitation to a family gathering that arrived to Daniel's phone but not mine, and was described afterwards as an oversight. A Sunday dinner where the conversation turned repeatedly to topics I had no context for, family history and inside references that required 20 years of presence I didn't have. Small things, individually explainable, together unmistakable. Daniel noticed. I know he noticed because I watched him notice and then decide not to name it, which is a particular kind of not noticing that is more painful than genuine obliviousness. I was being managed out of the circle, not removed entirely, that would have been too obvious, too conflicty, too hard to deny, but repositioned, moved from inside to periphery by the slow, patient application of 100 small exclusions. I want to tell you that I handled this with perfect equanimity. I did not. There were evenings when I came home from work and sat in the car in the driveway for longer than I needed to, processing the specific loneliness of a situation that is too subtle to explain to anyone without sounding paranoid. There were nights when I lay in the dark beside Daniel, who was sleeping, and I felt the weight of a marriage that was being slowly, deliberately tested by a woman who had never once framed it as a test. But I held my line, because on the other side of that line were my parents. George in his garden on Saturday mornings, Diane in her kitchen that smelled like my entire childhood. Two people who had spent 30 years building something honest and had never once suggested that I owed them anything for it. I was not going to let anyone turn them into a transaction, not even if it cost me something.
The conversation with Daniel happened on a Saturday evening in late June. Not because I had planned that specific night. I had been planning the conversation for several weeks, building toward it the way you build toward anything important, gathering the clarity you need before you open the door. But that particular Saturday had its own momentum. We had been to a cookout at his parents' house that afternoon, the kind of gathering that 6 months earlier I would have described as pleasant. Now I registered it with the observational precision of someone who has been studying a situation long enough to see its architecture clearly. Patricia had been warm to Daniel, attentive to Richard, gracious to the other guests. To me, she had been polite in exactly the degree that is indistinguishable from warmth to someone who isn't looking closely, and completely distinguishable from it to someone who is. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet. I waited until we were inside, until we were in the kitchen with the ordinary evening business of a Saturday. The leftover container put in the refrigerator, the shoes left by the door, the particular exhale of a couple returning to their own space after a social afternoon. Then I said, I need to talk to you about something, properly. He looked at me. He recognized my tone, which was not tense or emotional, but level, in the way that I am level when something matters enormously and I have decided not to waste the conversation. Okay, he said. We sat at the kitchen table.
I had thought about how to say this for weeks, and in the end, I had arrived at the conclusion that the only correct approach was directness without performance. Not a speech, not an ultimatum packaged as a conversation, just the truth, clearly stated from a person who loved him and needed him to understand something. Your mother has been pressuring me, and now you, to approach my parents about their estate. It started in the March dinner, and it has continued in various forms for 4 months. I've spoken to her directly about it, and I've told you my position. But I need to have a real conversation with you about what's happening, because it isn't just about my parents. He was quiet. Not defensive. He had his arms on the table and he was listening with the open expression of a man who knows something true is being said and making room for it. What I'm not going to do, I said, is approach my parents as though their home is an asset I'm entitled to plan around. I am not going to ask them about their will, their estate designations, their plans for the property. I will never do this. It is not a position I am willing to revise. I paused. That is the easy part of what I'm saying, I said. Here is the harder part. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, a small, attentive tightening. The way your mother has handled this, the escalation, the approach through you, the change in her behavior toward me since I refused, that is something our marriage cannot absorb indefinitely. Not because I can't handle difficult relationships, but because your response to it has been to manage me rather than address her. I looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you to choose between your mother and your wife. I know that sentence sounds, and I mean it. I am genuinely not asking for that. What I am asking for is simpler and harder. I need you to know where you stand, not where she stands, where you stand. Whether you think what she has been asking is right, whether you believe I am wrong to refuse. Silence. Outside the kitchen window, the summer evening was still going on, light remaining longer than it had any business remaining in late June, the warm, extravagant light of a southern summer.
I don't think you're wrong, Daniel said, quietly, like a person setting something down that had been heavier than they'd admitted. I don't think you're wrong, he said again. I think I've been... He stopped, started again. I think she got to me. The way she does, the practicality argument, the for your future framing. I let it become my argument without really examining whether it was what I actually believed. I looked at him. What do you actually believe? I said. A long pause. I believe, he said carefully, that your parents are people, not a financial situation, and that how you treat them is more important than anything they might leave you. He looked at the table. I should have said that to her in March. You should have, I said. Not cruelly, just honestly. I'm saying it now. I know, I said. We sat at the kitchen table for another hour, not arguing. That part was done, or at least the acute part was done. We talked about his mother, honestly, in a way we had not talked before. He acknowledged things he had been absorbing without naming, the management, the positioning, the way her warmth had always had a directional quality to it. He had grown up inside it and had long since stopped seeing it clearly. The dinner in March had created enough distance from it that he could see it now, or was beginning to. He said he would talk to her. I did not ask what he would say. That was between the two of them, and I had enough respect for both of them to leave that space alone. What I needed was what I had received, clarity about where my husband stood, the knowledge that the person sleeping beside me had located himself on the side of what was true, rather than on the side of what was convenient. That was enough. For now, that was enough. But Patricia did not receive the conversation with Daniel graciously. Whatever he said to her, and he told me afterward that he had been direct, that he had told her the pressure needed to stop, that Maya's decision was not going to change and should not be treated as a problem to be managed, she received it as a betrayal.
Not loudly. Patricia did not do loud betrayal. She did quiet, structural betrayal, the kind that operates through reduced access and ambient coldness, and the particular social skill of making one person feel unwelcome in a room without anyone being able to point to the specific mechanism. The invitations reduced further. The calls to me stopped. At the one family dinner we attended in July, Patricia was gracious to everyone present with the specific, comprehensive graciousness of a woman making a point through its very completeness. Everyone included, everyone warmly received, the air of a host who has no grievances whatsoever. I was treated as a guest, not unkindly, not rudely, as a guest. Daniel noticed. He said so on the way home with the specific discomfort of a man who is trying to hold a position that costs him something real. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't have to be sorry," I said. "She's punishing you." "She's punishing both of us," I said. "She's punishing you for what you said to her, and she's punishing me for what I wouldn't do. That's her choice. We can only control ours." He was quiet. "Are we okay?" he said. I looked at him. "We're better than we were in March," I said honestly. "That's real progress." He took my hand on the center console. We drove home in the warm July dark, and I held his hand and I thought about my parents' house in Glenwood Park and my father's garden and the thing I had refused to do and what it was already costing and why it was still, completely and without question, the right decision. Some things cost what they cost, and some things are worth exactly that.
July was quiet in the way that comes after something has been said and before its consequences have fully arrived. Daniel and I found a new rhythm. Not without friction, not without the occasional evening where the strain of the situation surfaced in the small, sideways ways that stress surfaces in a marriage, but we were talking, honestly, more than before. The conversation in the kitchen had opened something between us that the previous months of managed silence had been slowly closing, and the opening was worth the discomfort of the air that came through it. Patricia remained cool, not hostile. She was never going to be hostile, it wasn't her register, but the warmth had been dialed to a setting that communicated, clearly, to anyone paying attention that something had changed. Richard, as far as I could tell, was largely unaware of the dynamics, or if he was aware, he had made the long-married man's calculation that certain things were best left to their own resolution. I was lonely in the specific way of someone whose social world has been partially restructured by another person's decision. Daniel's family had been, over 3 years, a part of my regular life. Sunday dinners, gatherings, the peripheral warmth of belonging to an extended household. Its partial withdrawal was not devastating, but it was present. The thing I had not anticipated was my parents. Not their reaction, they didn't know, not specifically, not yet, but the way the situation made me hold myself differently around them, carefully, with the specific guardedness of someone carrying a secret they haven't decided how to share. My mother noticed within 2 visits. She was, as I mentioned, a woman with a librarian's particular gift for finding what someone needed before they fully knew they needed it, which applied equally to books and to her daughter's emotional state. We were having coffee in her kitchen on a Saturday morning in August, my father's voice audible from the backyard, where he was doing something to the tomato plants, in the one-sided conversational tone he used in the garden, and she set down her mug and looked at me with the direct, patient attention that had been her primary parenting tool my entire life. "What's going on?" she said. Not, "Is something going on?" Not, "You seem a little quiet," just, "What's going on?" I looked at my own coffee. "Things have been a little complicated," I said. "With Daniel?" "With his family, and Daniel, mostly his mother." My mother was quiet. She had met Patricia 4 times and formed, I suspect, a fairly accurate impression on limited data, because she was good at that. "What kind of complicated?" she said. And here was the moment I had been navigating toward and away from for months, the moment of honesty that would require me to tell my parents that they had been the subject of someone else's financial strategy, that their home, their garden, their kitchen, 26 years of careful building had been evaluated as a resource by a woman they barely knew.
I could not tell them that. Not fully, not yet. There have been some conversations, I said carefully, about practical things, future planning. His mother has opinions about how Daniel and I should be thinking about the future, and some of those opinions I disagree with. My mother held my gaze. Opinions about your future or opinions about ours? I looked at her. She knew, or close enough to knew. Some of both, I said quietly. A silence. Then my mother picked up her coffee mug and looked out the backyard window at the backyard, where my father's voice was now narrating something to the tomato plants in the one-sided, conversational tone he used in the garden, and she said, "Your father and I have been thinking about some things ourselves. Mama, not because of pressure," she said quickly, and looked at me with the direct gaze that meant she was saying something important. On our own time, because we're in our 60s and we're organized people, and organized people make plans. She paused. "We've been meaning to sit down with you, properly, not today, but soon. You don't have to. Maya." Her voice was gentle but complete, the voice that ended certain conversations, not by closing them, but by making further protest unnecessary. She refilled my coffee. My father came in from the garden with a tomato in each hand, delighted, and the moment passed into the ordinary warmth of a Saturday morning, but it stayed with me. "We know who you are."
September brought a particular tension. Daniel's cousin was getting married in October, a large family wedding, the kind Patricia organized around as a social centerpiece. The invitation arrived jointly, which meant I was included, which meant the question of attendance became a several days conversation between Daniel and me. I did not want to go. I want to be honest about this because I think pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The thought of spending a full day in Patricia's social orbit, performing the warmth of a family relationship that had been quietly restructured, was something I genuinely did not want to do. But I went. Because Daniel asked me to, because the cousin had nothing to do with the dynamics between me and Patricia, and because I had promised myself, early in the situation, that I would not become someone whose response to being managed was to manage back. The wedding was beautiful. The cousin was happy. I danced with Daniel at the reception, and for stretches of an hour at a time, the difficulty of the previous months receded into the background, where it belonged. Patricia, across the reception hall, caught my eye once. She smiled. I smiled. It was the most complex social exchange of my adult life compressed into 2 seconds. What I held on to through those months was simple, not the hope that Patricia would change, or that the situation would resolve itself, or that the family dynamics would spontaneously reorganize into something more honest. I had no expectation of those outcomes. What I held on to was the fact of what I had done, the thing I had refused, and what the refusal meant. I had been asked to treat my parents as a resource. I had said no. I had said no when it was socially costly, when it created friction in my marriage, when it meant being repositioned from inside to periphery by a woman who conducted her social world with the efficiency of someone who has never tolerated uselessness for long. And my parents, in their house in Glenwood Park, in the garden that my father talked to, and the kitchen that smelled like my childhood, they had not been approached. They had not been pressured. They had not been made to feel, even for a moment, that their daughter's love was contingent on their financial decisions. That was the thing I held. On the difficult evenings, in the car and the driveway, in the late-night arithmetic of whether this was all worth what it was costing, I held that. And it was, consistently and without exception, enough. The call came on a Tuesday evening in October. My mother's voice, warm, specific, carrying the particular quality of someone who has made a decision and is comfortable with it. "Your father and I would like you to come for dinner on Saturday," she said. "Just you, if that's all right. We have some things we'd like to go over with you." Just you. "Of course," I said. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is very okay," she said, and the specific warmth in those 4 words told me she meant it completely. Saturday evening, my parents' house. My father had made his pot roast, the slow-cooked kind that meant he had started it in the morning, and my mother had set the table properly, which she did for occasions she was treating as occasions.
3 places, the good placemats, the candles she brought out for family dinners. We ate first. My father talked about the garden, the fall planting, the garlic he had put in, the perennial beds he was rethinking for next spring. My mother talked about a book she had finished and wanted me to read. I talked about a design project I was working on that I was particularly proud of. It was dinner. It was just dinner. It was the specific comfort of a table where you are completely known and completely welcome, and there is no subtext in the room. After dinner, my mother cleared the plates and my father brought a folder to the table. My father was not a man of speeches. He said what he meant and then stopped, which had always, in my experience, been more effective than saying more. He opened the folder. He placed 2 documents on the table and turned them to face me. "Your mother and I met with an estate attorney 6 weeks ago," he said. "We've had a will in place for years, but we wanted to update it properly, make sure everything is clear." I looked at the documents. Legal language, organized and specific. "We're not going anywhere," my mother said, with the slight smile of someone preempting a concern. "But organized people make plans, and we are organized people." My father pointed to specific provisions. The house, designated to me as sole heir, with a life estate provision that allowed them to remain in it for as long as they chose. A separate investment account I had not known existed, accumulated over 30 years of careful, consistent contribution, also designated to me. I looked at the numbers. I looked at my parents. "Daddy, I didn't know about the investment account." "We know you didn't," he said. "We didn't talk about it because it wasn't yours yet. It's ours. We've been building it since you were 5 years old." He paused. "But it will be yours, and we wanted you to know." The amount was not extravagant. It was not a fortune that would have satisfied Patricia's calculations of what was worth pursuing. But it was real. It was significant. It was 30 years of patient, consistent, dignified accumulation by 2 people who never spent money they didn't have. And there was something else. My mother reached into the folder and took out a single folded piece of paper, not a legal document, a letter, handwritten in her particular slanted script. She slid it across the table to me. "You can read that later," she said, "when you're alone." I held it. "We know," my father said, "that there have been pressures. We don't know all of it. You've protected us from it, and we appreciate that. But we know our daughter. We know what she would and wouldn't do, and we wanted to make sure that whatever has been happening, you knew where we stand and what we've built and who it's for." He put his hand on mine briefly. My father, who communicated primarily through patience and presence and the occasional tomato from the garden, put his hand on mine for a moment. "It's always been for you," he said. I read my mother's letter that night, alone in my car in the driveway of our house, the way I had done many things over the previous months. She wrote about watching me grow up, about what they had hoped for when they had me, about the specific thing they had observed in the years of my marriage, not the problems, but the quality, the way I loved Daniel with honesty rather than performance, the way I had carried something difficult without letting me make me bitter. She wrote, "We have never once worried about whether you would love us correctly, but we have wanted to make sure you knew, clearly, legally, on paper, that we love you correctly too. What we have built is yours, Maya. It has always been yours, not because you asked for it, because you never did." I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, not crying exactly, something more complete than crying. The specific, profound feeling of being known, of having done the right thing and been seen doing it by the people whose seeing mattered most. Not because you asked for it, because you never did. My mother had understood everything. She had understood it from the Saturday morning in August when she looked at me over her coffee mug and said, "We know who you are." She went home and talked to my father, and they did what organized, dignified, principled people do. They had made their plans on their own time, for their own reasons, and they had made sure I knew. Patricia had told me to demand my parents' inheritance. My parents had given it to me because I refused.
I did not tell Daniel about the dinner immediately. Not as strategy, not to hold something over him or to time a revelation for maximum impact, but because I needed a few days to carry what my parents had given me in private before it became a part of a larger conversation. Some things need to be yours alone for a little while before they can be shared. I told him on a Wednesday evening, quietly, at the kitchen table, the same table where we had sat in June when I drew the line and he found his footing. I told him about my parents' call, the dinner, the estate documents, the investment account. I told him about the letter, not the contents of it. Those were still mine, would always be mine, but the fact of it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "They did all of this," he said. "On their own?" "Yes." "Without you asking?" "I did not ask," I said. "I specifically never asked." Another silence. He looked at the table, at his hands, at something in the middle distance that I recognized as the expression of a man reviewing a sequence of events and understanding them differently than he had before. "My mother was wrong," he said. Not she had good intentions, not she was trying to help, just she was wrong. "Yes. And if you had done what she asked," he stopped. "If you had pressured your parents, it would have been the wrong thing. For them, for me, for us." He nodded, slowly, with the weight of someone integrating something that changes the shape of a previous understanding. "I want to talk to her," he said. The conversation between Daniel and Patricia happened without me, which was right. He told me afterward that he had driven to his parents' house on a Thursday evening and sat with his mother in the living room and told her plainly what my parents had done. Not to reopen the argument about inheritance or to make a point about who had been right, but because he felt she needed to understand the full picture, what her campaign actually looked like from the outside, what it nearly cost him, and what the outcome had been. He told me she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't think they had that kind of—" "It's not about the money, Mom. It was never about the money." She was quiet again. "Maya's parents did what they did because of who Maya is, because of the kind of person she's been to them. That's not something that can be engineered. That's not something you can strategize someone into." He told me she did not respond to this immediately. He told me that when he left, she had looked older than she had when he arrived. Not in a cruel way, in the way that a person looks when they have come into contact with a truth that required the revision of something they had held with confidence. Patricia called me the following Saturday morning. I saw her name on my phone, and I held it for a moment before answering. "Maya." Her voice had a quality I had not heard before, not her social warmth, not her managed directness, something quieter. "Hi, Patricia." "I owe you an apology," she said. I was quiet. I let the words exist in the space between us without rushing to fill it. "I'm interfered in something that wasn't my business," she said. "I treated your parents as though they were a variable to be managed, rather than people to be respected. And I put you in an impossible position for months, and did not acknowledge what that cost you." She paused. "I'm sorry, Maya. I genuinely am." I held the phone. I want to tell you that I felt triumph in that moment. I did not. Or I felt something so much more complicated than triumph that the word doesn't fit. I felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a situation resolving itself the way situations sometimes resolve when you hold your position long enough for the truth to do its own work. And I felt something for Patricia that surprised me slightly, something close to compassion. She was a woman who had spent her life managing situations, because managing situations was what she trusted. The thought of things being outside her control, her son's future,
her family's resources, the variables she could not optimize, had produced in her an anxiety she had channeled outward in ways she may not have fully examined. That was not an excuse, but it was a human thing. "I appreciate that," I said. "Thank you for saying it." A pause. "Daniel said," she started, "he said your parents are wonderful people." "They are," I said. "I'd like to meet them properly sometime," she said, "if that would ever be welcome." I thought about my mother in her kitchen, my father in his garden, the letter in my nightstand drawer. "I think that could happen," I said. I do not want to tell you that everything resolved into warmth and ease after that call, because it did not. Not immediately, not completely. Relationships that have been structured by management for years do not restructure themselves in a single phone call, however genuine. Patricia and I would spend the following months finding a different way of being in each other's lives, slower and more careful and considerably more honest than what had come before. There were still moments of friction. There were still conversations where I could feel the old habits pulling at the edges of the new ones. But there was also, for the first time, the sense that we were operating in the same reality, that the unspoken things had been spoken, and that what existed between us now was actual rather than performed. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. Daniel and I went to my parents' house for dinner in November. All four of us, Daniel included, properly included, with my father showing him the winter garden, and my mother feeding him enough for 3 people. Daniel looked in my parents' kitchen like a person encountering something he hadn't known he was missing. The specific quality of a table where everything is simple and nothing is managed, where the warmth is not conditional, where you are invited as yourself, not as a function. He helped my father carry dishes. He listened to my mother's thoughts on a book. He was, that evening, exactly the man I had married, warm and genuine and capable of being present in a room without calculating what the room could offer him. On the drive home, he said, "Your parents are extraordinary." "I know," I said. "The way he paused, finding the words, "they just love you. That's it. There's nothing else in it." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's what I want us to be," he said. "That's what I want to build." I looked at him. "Then let's build it," I said.
I am telling you this story from the kitchen table of our house in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a Sunday morning in early spring. Daniel is in the backyard. He started a small garden last fall, nothing like my father's, not yet, but the beginning of one. A raised bed he built himself from lumber he bought and cut himself, following instructions he found and then called my father to verify. And my father had walked him through it on the phone with the patient specificity he brought to anything involving wood and soil. They talk now, my father and Daniel, every couple of weeks, about the garden, about nothing much, about the ordinary things that 2 men in a family talk about when they have decided to be in each other's lives. That raised bed is the most hopeful thing in my backyard. I want to tell you what I learned. Not as rules. I have lived enough of my own life now to distrust the packaging of hard experience into tidy prescriptions. What worked in my particular situation, with my particular parents and my particular marriage and my particular mother-in-law, may not translate directly into yours. I know that. But I want to offer what I actually learned. Honestly, the way I offer anything that has cost me something and turned out to be worth the cost. The first thing, love and leverage are not the same thing, and the difference matters enormously. Patricia believed she was acting in our interests. I think she believed that genuinely. She thought that securing the inheritance, clarifying the asset, positioning us advantageously, this was love made practical. And I understand the argument. I even understand the anxiety underneath it, the specific fear of watching the people you love enter a future that isn't fully secured.
But what she was proposing was the conversion of my parents from people into a position, from a relationship into a resource. And that conversion, however warmly intended, was a betrayal of what a relationship actually is. Love that uses people as leverage, even well-intentioned love, even love dressed in practical language, is not love. It is management. And the managed always know, eventually, that they are being managed. The second thing, what you refuse tells people who you are as clearly as what you do. I did not do anything heroic in this story. I did not rescue anyone. I did not make a dramatic gesture or say something brilliant that changed the room. I refused. That is all I did. I said no, repeatedly, calmly, at personal cost to something I knew was wrong. And that refusal, that single, sustained, costly refusal, is what my parents saw. It is what Daniel came to understand. It is what eventually shifted the ground between me and Patricia. You cannot manufacture integrity. You cannot perform it. It is only visible in the moments when doing the right thing costs something and you do it anyway. Those are the moments that define you to the people who matter. The third thing, your parents' love for you is not a debt you owe them, and it is not a debt they owe you. My parents built what they built because they were organized, principled, careful people who loved their daughter and wanted her to be secure. They designated it to me, not because I demanded it, not because I positioned myself correctly, not because I played any kind of long game. They did it because of who I was to them, because of 30 years of a relationship that had nothing to do with what they owned. I could not have engineered that outcome. No one could. You cannot engineer being loved. You can only be the kind of person who deserves it, and trust that the people who love you know the difference. The fourth thing, marriage is built or diminished by what each partner is willing to hold. Daniel and I are stronger now than we were before March. I do not say this as a silver lining that makes the difficulty worthwhile. The difficulty was the difficulty, and I would have preferred not to have lived through it. But we are stronger, because we had a conversation we needed to have, because Daniel found his position and stood in it at cost to himself, the way that mature love eventually requires. Because I trusted that our marriage was worth the risk of a difficult truth, and the marriage turned out to be exactly that worth. Your partner's loyalty, tested and proven, is worth more than anything their family might have to offer. And the last thing, the most important thing, the people who love you without conditions will always outmaneuver the people who love you with them. Patricia had a strategy, a careful, patient, socially sophisticated strategy built on her accurate reading of what was valuable and her conviction that value should be captured and secured. My parents had none of that. They had a folder and an estate attorney and 30 years of a specific kind of love that does not keep score. They had a letter, written in my mother's slanted hand, that said, "What we have built is yours because you never asked for it." That letter is in my nightstand drawer. It has been there since October, and I have read it many times, not obsessively, but in the moments when I need to remember what it looks like when love has no leverage in it, when love is just love, clean and complete and entirely itself. My name is Maya. I am 29 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. My mother-in-law told me to demand my parents' inheritance. I refused, and in refusing, I received something no demand could have produced. Not the house, not the investment account, not the estate documents in their legal folder. The knowledge, written in my mother's handwriting, confirmed by my father's hand on mine, growing in the raised bed Daniel built in our backyard, that I am the kind of person who knows the difference between love and leverage, and that difference is everything. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for new stories every week, and if you've ever been asked to treat the people you love as a transaction, leave a comment. You are not alone.